September 10, 1977, the day the guillotine was used for the last time. Until reaching the year 1977 and making its final cut, the guillotine had to go through different eras, different countries and many necks. When thinking of the guillotine, it is automatically linked with France and the Revolution, but similar mechanisms had been used for several centuries. The display of severed heads had long been one of the ways in which European sovereigns demonstrated their power to their subjects. The guillotine, of course, was the most used method of execution during the 1789 Revolution, especially in the period known as the Terror. By that point in history, this method of taking life already had a great trajectory among European countries such as the United Kingdom, Sweden, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. Decapitation, or in other words, the separation by severing of the head and body, was already carried out in antiquity manually, using a sword, a knife, or an axe. After this method was automated using the guillotine. It was common for the guillotine to be raised on a scaffold. The scaffold was a structure that was built for the development of a solemn event. However, the decapitation mechanisms from which the guillotine originates are older than the 18th century. One of the most famous and possibly one of the first was the Halifax gibbet. Its name is due to the city of Halifax in England where it was first used. This device had a wooden structure similar to that of the guillotine, with the difference that instead of a sharp blade it had a large axe head attached to a solid wooden block. This device would also have been mounted on a scaffold in the main squares. The Halifax gibbet dates back to the year 1066, although the first certain reference is from the decade of 1280. This machine was of course used in public executions and remained in use until April 30th of 1650. A clear example of the use of these early machines is due to the painting The Execution of Moorcote Balloch near Merton in Ireland 1307. With this suggestive title, a quite clear image is left. The victim's name is Moorcote Balloch and was beheaded by a guillotine similar to the French one. But the big difference lies in the executioner, who had a large hammer ready to trigger the mechanism. There is no evidence that this machine really existed, or at least not as it is shown in this work of art. Now, going back to the traditional guillotine, at first the steel blade was straight on a wooden scale and then his neck was clamped. The executioner activated the mechanism and the blade fell precisely on the neck, separating the head from the trunk at the level of the fourth cervical vertebra. Once separated, the head was collected in a leather bag. This change in the vertical blade had been made to cause a painless death, and by this time, this method of execution was only used for powerful people, people of higher lineage and wealthy people. At that time, being executed by the guillotine was quite a privilege. In that era, the death penalty was a highly unequal punishment, and when they were sentenced to death, they suffered decapitation, a quick and seemingly painless method. On the other hand, common men and women were executed using brutal methods such as hanging, quartering, or burning at the stake. They even used more imaginative methods, like tying each of the victim's limbs to a horse and then forcing them to gallop in different directions. The result was the dismemberment of the bodies. The pain was extreme, added also to the grotesque show. During the 18th century, many jurists and men of letters denounced the recourse to torture for disproportionate penalties and the privileges of the aristocracy. Some even went so far as to call for the abolition of the death penalty. Opposition to these punishments was slowly growing, mainly due to the philosophies of thinkers like Voltaire and Locke, who argued for humane methods of execution. On October 10, 1789, a 50-year-old doctor named Joseph Ignace Guillotine presented a proposal to establish equality before the law also in matters of criminal law. These were some of his proposals. Crimes of the same kind will be punished with the same kind of penalty, regardless of the rank or condition of the guilty party, he affirmed. This principle, which today seems normal, was somewhat strange at the time of the French Revolution. Joseph Guillotine's position on execution was never very clear, as it was not known whether the doctor was in favor of capital punishment or not. Wanted it to be abolished. Guillotine's proposal to equalize death penalties had been to extend the method of decapitation, which until then was only used for the aristocracy, and he wanted it to be available to all social classes. To avoid the mistakes often made by executioners using an axe or a sword, he proposed using a device that would cut off the head in the blink of an eye. Guillotine's reference to this method of execution sparked discussions throughout France, but it had been, believe it or not, a step towards equality. The belief that he was the inventor of what we know today as the guillotine is mistaken, as we saw earlier. Very similar mechanisms were used since the 16th century. On May 30th, 1791, in the debates on the new penal code, the deputy Louis Michel Lepelletier de Saint-François went further and would have proposed the total abolition of the death penalty. His friend Robespierre was one of the few who supported this measure, but both of their efforts had been in vain. On June 1st, 1791, the vast majority of deputies had voted for the death penalty. 2 days later, Lepelletier proposed the principle of equality for the death penalty. Every person sentenced to death will be beheaded. With all these back and forth, the code was approved on September 25, 1791, making this clear in the second and third articles. Article 2. The death penalty will consist of the simple deprivation of life without ever being able to exercise any torture towards the condemned. Article 3. Every condemned person will have their neck cut. In this way, equality before the law extended to criminal execution. In March of 1792, a year after the implementation of the new penal code, the definitive development of the new execution device was entrusted to the surgeon Antoine Louis, perpetual secretary of the Academy of Surgery. Louis and his collaborator Tobias Schmidt, a German harp maker, created a device inspired by similar devices that had been used in other European countries, but improving its design and functionality with the aim of minimizing pain as much as possible. Louis's main contribution was the model of the blade with an oblique edge so that it cuts cleanly and reaches its target, as he himself claimed. However, both doctors later regretted that their names were associated with these devices, which were first known as Louisette and then as Guillotine. The prototype was built in 2 weeks and animals were the first to test it. The final test was carried out in a hospital in Visitor, where 3 carefully chosen corpses, because they were robust men, were successfully decapitated. Finally, the guillotine was installed in Gerbe Square, in front of the Paris City Hall. In this very place, on April 25, 1792, Nicolas Jacques Pelletier was sentenced for armed robbery and would become the first executed by this new procedure. The guillotine fulfilled its new purpose. An ordinary criminal had the privilege of dying without feeling pain or agony. However, just a few months later, on August 21, 1792, 2 political prisoners, 2 servants of Louis XVI, were brought before the guillotine, both accused of counter-revolutionary activity. From that moment, under a revolutionary government regime that would last until the fall of Robespierre, the guillotine would become the symbol of the politics of terror, putting the aristocracy, betrayals, and below, common crimes in check. During the harsh period of terror, the total number of people executed by the guillotine throughout France was 16,594. Of these, 2,622 were executed in Paris, mainly on the guillotine that was placed in what is now the Place de la Concorde. In that very place, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and even Robespierre himself would be executed. It was estimated that the number of those executed during the Reign of Terror would have risen between 35,000 and 40,000 victims, including popular violence, political executions, and deaths in prisons. After the Reign of Terror, the guillotine continued to be used. It continued to be used under the command of Napoleon, and all subsequent regimes kept it in force for almost 2 centuries. As I told you earlier, it was not only common criminals who lost their heads to the sharp blade of the guillotine. Several celebrities of the time, several politicians, several monarchs also fell by this means of execution. Let's review some of them. Marie Antoinette belonged to the royal family of Austria. She arrived in France at the age of 14 to marry the young Louis XVI in order to form a diplomatic alliance between both countries. Like her husband, she squandered the money of a nation on jewels, dresses, and obscene and unnecessary luxuries. Her lifestyle earned her the hatred of her entire people, and when they had the opportunity to sentence her to death, they did not hesitate for a second to dismember her head and end a story of absurd eccentricity. The guillotine took care of silencing her. Louis XVI was the worst monarch in French history. He was a man who took refuge in food to cover up his insecurities. While they ate from the most varied menus in the Palace of Versailles, his people were dying of hunger in the streets of Paris. His terrible leadership led his nation to ruin and condemned him to death. When the Third Estate got tired of his antics, they stormed his mansion and arrested him. He was imprisoned for a while in Paris until one night he decided to escape to Austria to seek refuge, but all he found was the blade of the guillotine cutting his royal neck. He was accused of treason. Robespierre was a political genius. His incredible skill with words and sharpness in thought led him to the pinnacle of the revolution. At first he advocated for the rights of citizens, but over the years power turned him into one of the most repugnant Frenchmen for sending hundreds of people to the guillotine. He had forgotten the fundamental values he sought and gave himself over completely to fury and vengeance. At the end of his days, all the misfortune he fostered came back to him. The same machine he used to eliminate his enemies killed him on the 18th of July, 1794. Charlotte Corday was a woman who suffered the terror that the guillotine instilled. She saw how Paris was drowning in a bloodbath. The young woman believed that Jean-Paul Marat's death, the revolutionary newspaper director, would stop the killing. She assassinated Jean-Paul Marat with a stab wound while he was bathing in a tub with water and sulfur to combat his syphilis. Both were significant figures during the French Revolution. She was guillotined to death. Louis de Saint-Gilles was Robespierre's right-hand man. They called him the Angel of Terror. He pursued and sentenced dozens of revolutionaries to death. He annihilated a large part of the nobility. After wiping out the nobility and when the people had enough of the random and unjust deaths, Louis de Saint-Gilles was sentenced to death, ending the darkest period of France. Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier is considered today one of the most important scientists in history, as his studies revolutionized the conception and use of chemistry. He was so immersed in his work that the revolution was alien to him. He was unjustly accused out of envy. When he was brought to court, he said the Republic does not need scientists or chemists. You can't stop the action of justice. In this way, he signed his sentence and died on May 8, 1794. Jacques-René Herbert was the editor of the radical newspaper Le Père de Jeunes. Like Jean-Paul Marat, Jacques' pen condemned many men to the guillotine. Jacques became a spokesman for death, but in the madness that he himself created, the leaders turned against him and blamed him for treason. His head rolled on February 7, 1792. Georges Jacques Danton, one of the fathers and great figures of the Revolution. Danton was the spokesperson for the Third Estate. He was always in favor of the French people. From the start of the Revolution, he spoke at various conventions in favor of citizens' rights. When the movement stumbled and changed its course, Danton was one of the few lawyers and politicians who recognized that everything was getting out of control. As a result of his refusal, Robespierre silenced him, stripped his rights, and ultimately executed him. He was sentenced to death on April 5, 1794. His last cry was, "Show my head to the people." It's worth it. Now we should stop talking about the guillotine during the times of the French Revolution and think about the modern era. This decapitation machine did not stop working after the time of terror. In fact, its use extended until 1977. That year, the sharp blade fell for the last time. The last victim of this decapitation machine was Amida Yandoubi, of Tunisian origin, who was executed at the age of 28. The man had murdered his 21-year-old girlfriend Elizabeth Bousquet. Jean Duby was a pimp who forced young women into prostitution and made them pay him for the jobs he got them. With this in mind, he approached Elizabeth Busquets, whom he seduced and then forced into prostitution. But the young woman rejected him and promptly reported him. Jean Duby was arrested, and as soon as he was released, in 1973, he sought revenge on Busquets. In 1974, he kidnapped her, took her to his house where he lived with 2 other girls whom he forced into prostitution, and in front of them, he abused and tortured the 21-year-old young woman. Then he took her to the outskirts of Marseille where he strangled her until he took her life. On February 25, 1977, Jean Duby was charged with murder, rape, torture, and premeditated violence, for which he was sentenced to death by nothing more and nothing less than the guillotine. That year, France had guillotined 2 death row inmates without President Valéry Giscard granting pardons. In the case of Jean Duby, the leader maintained his stance and denied the presidential pardon. On September 10, 1977, in the Marseille prison, at 4:40 in the morning, the guillotine blade fell on the neck of the Tunisian murderer. In 1981, the new president François Mitterrand abolished the death penalty in France, and the guillotine became a thing of the past. The decapitation of the Tunisian Amida Jean Duby by guillotine was the last execution of this style that was carried out in the world. And that's it for today's video. I hope you have learned all the history of the guillotine, how it was built, what inspired it, who fell under this sharp blade. If you're interested, please subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications, leave a like, and I invite you to watch the other videos that I recommend here. My name is Magnus Mephisto, and this was the day that... Thank you for watching the video.